Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're looking at something that feels quite persistent, doesn't it? This link between really intense creativity and often quite profound personal suffering. Is artistic brilliance a gift? Or is it more of a burden? It almost makes you think, is creation itself some kind of negotiation?
Yeah.
With something buried deep down, maybe something dark.
It's a connection that's hard to ignore,
Yeah.
really. When you look at the history of art, these patterns, they just keep showing up. There's often this weight, this struggle.
Yeah.
And it's not just stories we tell. Some studies actually point to, higher rates of things like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder among highly creative people. That whole idea of a tortured artist.
Yeah.
It sticks around for a reason.
Absolutely. You immediately think of people like Van Gogh, right? His paintings are just bursting with life and color, but his actual life, so much loneliness, turmoil, and then that tragic end.
Or Sylvia Plath, that fierce, raw poetry. And again, such a devastating final act.
And Hemingway, a giant of literature, wrestling with his own demons until, well, they won. It just forces the question, is this all just coincidence? A string of sad stories? Or is there some deeper connection at play?
Well, one really interesting way to look at this comes from a certain viewpoint, let's say, that sees the human mind as this constant battlefield.
A battlefield.
Yeah, between our basic, often unconscious drives and desires and the rules and constraints that society, that civilization puts on us. And from that angle, art isn't just expression. It becomes this crucial release valve.
A release valve.
And also the very place where these inner conflicts actually fight it out.
Okay, let's dig into that. Van Gogh. He seems like such a prime example. The art is so raw, so emotional. But like you said, his life was incredibly difficult. Isolation, poverty, rejection. He even talked about feeling frustrated, right? That he couldn't quite capture what he wanted to.
Exactly, and that very frustration, that gap he felt between his intense inner world and, his ability to get it all out onto the canvas,
Yeah.
that could actually be seen as part of what drove him.
Huh.
Art becomes this way of wrestling with those powerful, maybe socially unacceptable feelings. Feelings that just don't have another outlet. The canvas becomes the stage for these inner dramas.
Right, and that connects to this idea of sublimation. Is that the term?
Precisely. Sublimation.
Yeah.
The idea that impulses society deems unacceptable, aggression, raw desire, whatever, get channeled into something else, something more, well, socially acceptable.
Like channeling aggression into sports, maybe? Or intense feelings into poetry?
Yeah, those are classic examples. But for artists, it's often much more complex than just a simple swap. It's a deep negotiation.
A negotiation.
Yeah, between their inner drives and what the outside world expects or allows. It's a way to give voice to those intense feelings, but in a form that might actually be received, or at least tolerated. It's a constant balancing act.
But who decides what's acceptable, Where do those expectations even come from?
That's a really crucial question. It brings up power structures, morality, the whole social fabric, really. From when we're kids, we learn to suppress things, don't we? Boys aren't supposed to show vulnerability. Maybe girls aren't supposed to be too ambitious. We internalize these rules, and there's always this sort of unspoken threat if you step too far out of line.
Oscar Wilde springs to mind there. Just brilliant wit, exploring really taboo subjects in Victorian England, a sensation. But his refusal to conform, his homosexuality, it led to his complete downfall, imprisonment.
Exactly. His brilliance was his nonconformity.
And the picture of Dorian Gray almost feels like he was writing his own future, exploring those hidden desires, the hypocrisy.
It really does. His art was both his shield, in a way, letting him express things, but it also painted a target on his back. It exposed the very things society wanted hidden.
And you still see that tension today, don't you? Even now, artists still walk these invisible lines, depictions of violence, sexuality, challenging stereotypes. There can still be serious backlash.
Definitely. And if we pull back again to that broader perspective, the idea is that civilization itself is built on repression.
Built on repression, how so?
Well, the thinking goes that for us all to live together somewhat peacefully, we have to suppress our most primal, selfish urges. But that energy doesn't just disappear.
Right, it has to go somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And art becomes one of the main places it goes.
So art acts like a kind of safety valve for the pressure cooker of civilization.
In a sense, yes. Think about ancient Greek tragedy. Those playwrights explored incredibly dark stuff. Incest, horrific revenge, total chaos.
Oedipus, Medea.
Right. And by watching those forbidden desires and actions play out safely on stage, the audience could experience a kind of catharsis, a release. It resonated because it touched those deep, often forbidden human chords.
But there's a paradox there, isn't there? Art explores the forbidden, but it also kind of contains it, keeps it safely within the frame of the artwork. A violent movie might stir us up, but it's contained. The impulse becomes an aesthetic thing, not necessarily real-world action.
That's a key part of the idea. By giving form to these chaotic impulses, art might actually make them less threatening. The shocking thing becomes something to look at, to think about, maybe even admire, rather than something acted out in the street. It acknowledges the darkness without letting it run wild.
So the artist is stuck in this bind then. Conform for approval, but maybe feel inauthentic. Or rebel, be true to yourself, but risk getting shut down, alienated.
It's a real double-edged sword, absolutely.
And someone like Frida Kahlo, her work feels so intensely personal, dealing with her physical pain, loss, her identity after that horrific accident.
Yes. Her painting became the way she confronted all that turmoil. She didn't just endure it. She transformed it into something visible, something incredibly powerful.
Those self-portraits, they're so unflinching, looking right at the scars, physical and emotional. It really feels like she made that choice. Silence the pain or turn it into art.
Exactly. It wasn't just documenting, it was actively reshaping her suffering into a form that could be shared, understood, maybe even transcended in a way.
Her life and her art are just completely intertwined, showing that very connection we're talking about. The intensity of the struggle seems linked to the power of the creation.
Undeniably.
So where does that leave us? It feels like we're facing some really fundamental, maybe uncomfortable questions now. Like, is it even possible to create something really meaningful without wrestling with some kind of inner conflict? Can art exist outside this whole dynamic of repression and sublimation? Is the artist just doomed to walk this tightrope between their inner world and what society demands?
Those are exactly the questions we need to tackle. And to do that, we probably need to go back to that broader theory of culture. The idea that civilization itself is this fragile compromise.
The compromise between what?
Between our fundamental drives, what was termed eros, the life drive, the push towards connection, creation, love, pleasure.
Okay.
And its opposite, thanatos, the death drive, a pull towards, well, dissolution, destruction, silence. Art, in this view, happens right in the middle of that tension.
Right, eros, the life drive, connection, creation. But you said it's never completely free. It gets shaped by, what was it, an internal authority?
Exactly. From day one, our raw desires get channeled and molded by internalized rules, parents, society, morality.
Right.
This becomes this superego, you could say. It acts like an internal judge, keeping our pursuit of pleasure from becoming totally chaotic, keeping the social order intact.
So eros wants one thing, this internal judge wants another, creates conflict. And sublimation is the detour, channeling the unacceptable urges into acceptable activities.
Right. Sexual energy into intellectual pursuits, aggression into competition, destructive urges perhaps into art.
But you mentioned a cost, that this process isn't free.
Yes. Often the cost is guilt, shame, a feeling of self-denial almost. Constantly pushing down powerful parts of yourself creates this background hum of tension. Sublimation gives it an outlet, sure, but maybe at the price of feeling truly authentic.
Michelangelo comes to mind again. Unbelievable art, obviously. Celebrated. But then you have the speculation about his personal life, the possible homoerotic themes in the work, those intense letters. In Renaissance Italy, that would have been incredibly dangerous.
Absolutely. In a society that actively condemned and punished those desires, it's very plausible that his art became a kind of veiled outlet.
So those muscular, yearning figures
Could be seen as a transformation, right? Taking that intense, perhaps forbidden emotion and sublimating it into something culturally revered. Genius, but perhaps born from constraint.
So sublimation isn't just creative, it's a sacrifice, in a way. Trading raw truth for acceptance, authenticity for validation.
That's one way to look at it. Becoming perhaps complicit in your own repression, even as you create something beautiful from it.
And guilt. You're saying guilt is central to this, to civilization itself.
From this perspective, yes. That constant friction between our basic drives, the ids, and that internalized judge, the superego, creates this tension, this inherent guilt. And for artists, it can often fuel that relentless self-criticism. Never good enough.
Kafka. His work just screams guilt and alienation, doesn't it? Those impossible bureaucracies, characters condemned for unknown crimes, Gregor Samsa turning into an insect, Joseph K. under arrest.
He's the absolute master of capturing that feeling. And it seems deeply rooted in his own life, his struggles with his father, his job, his writing. He transformed that private anguish into these universal symbols of modern anxiety.
Yeah.
But even then, he was plagued by doubt, right? Wanted his work burned. that speaks volumes about the power of that internal conflict, that guilt.
Okay, let's talk about the other drive, Thanatos, the death drive. That sounds pretty bleak. How does that fit into creativity?
It sounds negative, but think about it this way. Creation often requires destruction. You have to break down old forms, challenge conventions, risk failure. There's an element of dismantling, of pushing towards chaos, even in the search for something new.
So it's not just about making, but also unmaking.
Exactly. That urge to disrupt, to break boundaries. It can be seen as tapping into that drive, but it's risky. It courts chaos.
Jackson Pollock, his whole method, the drips, the seeming randomness, it felt revolutionary, chaotic. And his personal life mirrored that turbulence, didn't it? The alcoholism, the self-destruction, ending in that car crash.
His art seems to embody that push against control, that embrace of chaos and risk. The process itself was a kind of recklessness, and tragically, his life seemed to follow that same pattern, almost like the death drive manifesting not just in the art but in the artist. It fueled the innovation, but ultimately well.
So we're back at the paradox. Art liberates, gives us release, lets us face fears, but it also imprisons, channels dangerous feelings into safe forms, reinforces the system.
Like a ritual sacrifice almost, keeping society stable by allowing these energies a controlled expression.
The whole history of censorship seems to prove that point, doesn't it? Governments, religions, always trying to control art because they know its power.
Absolutely. And even without explicit censorship, artists learn to censor themselves, don't they? They internalize the boundaries, they learn what's sayable.
James Joyce and Ulysses, banned as obscene, now it's a cornerstone of literature, shows how those boundaries can shift.
It does, but Joyce paid a heavy price for pushing them. It highlights the risks involved.
So is art inherently compromised? Is real freedom impossible in this framework?
Well, from this particular psychoanalytic view, complete freedom might be an illusion, maybe even undesirable. Those internal controls, the superego, are seen as necessary for civilization to even function.
Right.
Sublimation is the mediator, is how the individual negotiates with the collective. But what artists can do is shine a light on those mechanisms, expose the constraints.
Like the feminist art movement in the 60s and 70s, they weren't just sublimating, they were actively confronting the power structures, weren't they? Reclaiming female bodies, sexuality.
Exactly. Artists like Judy Chicago, Schneemann, Ramovich, they took that energy and aimed it directly at the source of oppression. The Dinner Party, Interior Scroll.
Rhythm Zero, powerful, challenging work.
They weaponized sublimation in a sense.
Yeah.
Turned it from just personal expression into a demand for change. Art as resistance.
So art can be a site of resistance. It can expose power dynamics, show the cost of just going along.
Definitely. But, and here's the twist again, even that resistance is rarely completely pure. It often still operates within and sometimes even depends on the very systems it's challenging. Galleries, funding, recognition.
Right. The paradox remains.
It does. It's complex.
Which brings us to this kind of unsettling final thought, perhaps. Is art less about individual triumph and more a symptom of our collective repression? Are masterpieces like beautiful scars left by civilization?
It's a provocative idea, isn't it? Art as a necessary compromise. Society gets to glimpse the forbidden, the chaotic, but safely contained. That Viennese perspective on civilization argues it demands we give up primal instincts for harmony. Laws, morals.
Yeah.
They enforce this.
And the repressed energy leaks out as neurosis or as art.
But the underlying tension never goes away.
It makes me think of Prometheus, stealing fire knowledge, creativity for humans, and getting punished eternally for it.
Yes, the artist as Prometheus, bringing light, bringing uncomfortable truths, but suffering for crossing the line. The fire is the forbidden thing civilization secretly wants, but also fears.
And the artist carries that burden.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Civilization needs artists, perhaps, to show the cracks, remind us of what we've suppressed. But paradoxically, by containing these revelations within art, the system kind of neutralizes them.
Catharsis, but no real change.
It can seem that way sometimes. Think of Picasso's Guernica. Just devastating. Raw horror of war.
Unforgettable.
But did it stop war? It hangs in a museum. A powerful statement, yes, but contained. Picasso himself reportedly said when asked to explain it, "No, you explain it." There's an irony there.
So art reveals, but it also conceals. It gives voice to the unspeakable, but maybe domesticates it too, makes it safe for us to consume.
It's that duality again. Catharsis without full accountability. The cycle seems to be suppression, expression, absorption, repeat.
But maybe that's too cynical. Is it always failure? Couldn't it be seen as negotiation? Sublimation is productive, right? No civilization without it.
That's the counter-argument, definitely.
Yeah.
Maybe the question isn't if art is compromised, but how it engages with that compromise. Does it just reflect the status quo, or does it push back, even subtly?
Like Shakespeare, working within rigid Elizabethan society, but exploring incredibly deep, sometimes subversive themes.
Absolutely. Hamlet's doubts, Lady Macbeth's ambition, challenging gender norms, Othello revealing racial poison. He tapped into universal human stuff, but also the specific anxieties of his time.
His genius was maybe holding all those contradictions together.
Precisely. He shows that even within tight constraints, art can offer profound insight and challenge us.
So art ends up being this mirror reflecting civilization's soul. Who we are, who we might be, but also the price we pay for becoming civilized. The artist kind of embodies that trade-off.
And engaging with it forces us, the audience, to see our own part in that trade-off, our own complicity.
Which brings us back to that first question. Disease or cure? This link between creativity and suffering.
And maybe the answer is neither,
Huh?
or both. Maybe art is like a wound that never quite heals. He keeps showing the fractures in us and in society. But maybe in that brokenness, there's also understanding, empathy, even hope. It's messy, human.
And crucially, you, the listener, you're part of this too. Just by listening, by engaging with art, you're in that cycle of repression and release. Maybe you find beauty in an artist's pain, meaning in their struggle.
You might admire the rebellion, but maybe unconsciously reinforce the norms they fight against. We're all implicated, aren't we?
So it makes you ask yourself, what are you willing to sacrifice? For beauty, for truth, for connection? Are you just watching, or are you taking some responsibility? Is art just escapism for you, or could it be transformative?
These aren't easy questions. They require some real thought.
It's like that myth of the labyrinth. Theseus going in to face the Minotaur. The labyrinth as a metaphor for us. Our desires, fears, contradictions. And art? Maybe art is like Ariadne's thread. It's a guide, maybe, but it doesn't promise an easy way out. Sometimes it just leads you deeper into the maze, forces you to confront things.
And perhaps that's the point. The journey through the maze, the grappling with the questions matters more than finding neat answers.
Yeah.
The process, the struggle. Maybe that's where the real value lies.
Embracing the uncertainty, living with the paradox.
Yes. And maybe, just maybe, discovering something in that struggle that feels worth creating, worth fighting for.